I'm going to talk to you something a bit much more practical today, which is about a sauna-based heat acclimation intervention. So obviously, heat acclimation is followed by numerous physiological adaptations. They were pretty well reviewed before, so I can be quick on that. Among them, obviously, you have an increase in plasma volume, which can help cardiac efficiency, which can translate into a decrease in relative intensity. And some studies have also reported improvement at the peripheral level, so which suggests, and as it has been discussed briefly as well, that they can be linked and followed by improvement in physical performance as well. So I'm going to just go through quickly 3 interesting studies in the field of performance with pretty well-trained athletes. So the first study was conducted in France, and it was a group of elite swimmers, and they divided this group into 3 subgroups for different winter camps. So the first subgroup stayed actually in Montpellier in France, while another group went for a week in Forêt, so at altitude, and the third group went to Guadeloupe to a tropical climate for the same duration. So same club, 3 teams, different location for the camps. They did pre and post a 400-meter time trial on so they swam for 400 meters. As you can see, the group that stayed in France, they even have a worsening in performance, probably because deception, they didn't travel, these guys. The group who traveled at altitude show no differences in the time trial, while the group that traveled to hot environment show moderate to large improvement in their swimming performance. The second remarkable study has been presented before, so I think most of you are aware of this study. So this cyclist, after training 10 days in a heat, managed to improve their time trial performance both in cool and hot conditions. Finally, a more recent study that was done here in Qatar with an AFL team from Australian football. They went in Qatar for a pre-season camp, and you see in black the typical changes in their high-intensity running performance evaluated through the yo-yo test. And these white triangles, these show actually the changes in running performance before and after the Qatar camp. And as you can see, while they were training in a heat for about 11 hours during these 2 weeks, which is not that much, they showed a pretty clear, greater and faster improvement in their running performance. So all these 3 studies performed quite in elite athletes or well-trained tend to suggest that heat acclimation can have interesting ergogenic benefit for performance in athletes. However, heat acclimation can have some limitation. The first, and especially I'm coming from a team sport background, is the space required, because obviously if you want to acclimatize athletes from individual sports, a heat chamber can be enough. You put a bike on or a treadmill. For our athletes, if you have 35 or 40 players, it's going to be difficult to put them at the same time in these small rooms. Another potential limitation of heat training is an eventual decrease in the intensity of the training. A little bit as what happens when you train high with the altitude training approach, is that because of altitude you're going to train, because of the heat you're going to train with less quality, which can impair your neuromuscular system as well. For that, a new approach has been designed, which is based on the use of sauna exposure post-training. We have a pretty cool study conducted in New Zealand a few years ago. And they just had 6 runners during the study, but it was a crossover design. So they had them doing first a control period, a washout, and then again the sauna intervention. And over 3 weeks, they had 12 exposure, so 30-minute sauna exposure post-training. And they observed a 7% increase in plasma volume. And interestingly for practitioners, an increase in 2 minutes of their exhaustion time during a time trial. So pretty interesting results. However, they just monitored pre and post data, so there is nothing on the time course. And obviously, because it's 3 weeks, a long period, so we could wonder if a shorter period would have the same effect. On the side of thinking of implementing this new strategy, for example, and Aaron will touch well on that this afternoon, I think it's still important to monitor the physiological and the adaptation of the players, of the athlete when they train, to make sure we adjust properly the training content. So among different variables that can be used for this monitoring, submaximal heart rate variability, exercise heart rate recovery are becoming quite practical and, let's say, recognized tools for practitioners to monitor training adaptations. And more specifically, we observed some correlation between changes in plasma volume and heart rate, indices of heart rate variability, so the positive correlated, so increase in plasma volume linked with increase in heart rate variability measured at rest. You also had studies showing correlations between changes in heart rate variability and changing, in this case, changes in 10K running times. So suggesting that if you were to use heart rate measures to track the adaptation to a sauna-based heat acclimation, we can have an idea of how do the athletes cope with the intervention. So the simple objective of this study were two. The first is about examining the time course of plasma volume changes during and after the sauna intervention, and also to see how or which of these heart rate indices can be used to monitor the adaptation to this specific intervention. So the methods, I will be brief on that. 7 pretty good-looking cyclists participated in studies. So importantly, they were pretty well trained on the top of looking good. And then about the experimental schedule, the sauna exposure lasted for 10 days. So after each training session, they were training almost every day. You see the condition. Then heart rate variability was measured in the morning every single day for 18 days before, during, and after. We did a few measurements, capillary blood measures, and then daily to estimate plasma volume changes. And a few times these arrows are the submaximal exercise test to get as well submaximal heart rate and heart rate recovery. We used the typical error of measurement expressed as a coefficient of variation as the smallest force-wide change. I will go more into detail after, like to have a baseline of this measure and then try to assess substantial, meaningful changes. And obviously, the training load of the athletes was monitored with a simple measure that, again, Aaron will develop this afternoon, just using the rate of pulse reduction and the time of training. So if you now look at the results, I think the first important results are just the adaptation of the athletes and the related training load. So you can see the actual training load and the variation, which are normal, the daily change in training load from the athletes before, and here this is during the intervention. And as you can see, there was a tendency possible to moderate decrease in their training load during the intervention. What is important is that we just advised or we requested the athletes to maintain the usual training load, but for some reason, as you can see, they didn't. And this reduction in training load was actually linked to an actual decrease in training volume, but also in training intensity assessed by RPE. So is that a consequence or more an adaptation, an anticipatory mechanism that the athletes knew they will go to the sauna after, then they train less? That's a bit unclear, but I think it's an important information to understand the results that we are going to go through now, but also that if you were to implement this kind of intervention, that training load has to be managed differently if you were to implement these sessions. So probably the most interesting physiological findings is about the pretty large increase in plasma volume, so about 16 to 17% within only 4 days, which is roughly 4% per day. And you can see it's well above the typical error of the measures. So it's roughly 3 times more than the error. So it's a very clear and large increase in plasma volume. And as you can see, after that, more surprisingly, there is a clear decrease and a maintenance of plasma volume above the typical error of measurement. If you look, and I will go quickly to that, to the response of the heart rate measures, so as expected, heart rate went down and stayed down when measured in the morning. As expected as well, heart rate variability went up, but not above the standard error. So it's kind of unclear changes. The result we have with submaximal heart rate are a bit over the place, I will say, so not really clear. We just have an increased exercise heart rate after, which is not really what we expected. We have clear impairment in heart rate recovery. So actually the heart rate recovery was getting worse during the intervention, which at first you wouldn't think that is really logical because you think increase plasma volume, increase fitness means, and we expect an increased heart rate recovery. But studies have shown that when you decrease your load, heart rate recovery can be worsened. So that's probably more linked to the decrease in load than any real change in fitness. And importantly, we found no correlation at the individual level between the change in plasma volume and the change in any of the heart rate measures. So to conclude, we observed pretty large increase in plasma volume only in 4 days, and this increase was pretty faster than most of the training in the heat studies, but then it decreased remarkably. And the value of heart rate measure to monitor plasma volume is a bit unclear under this setting. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Really not very good with technology. Thank you, Martin. Do we have any questions? Aaron?
Nice presentation, Martin. How do you explain the lack of correlation between plasma volume change and heart rate? What's your explanation?
Yeah. I think it's more related to the way we analyze the data. At this time, we just have all the data pulled together, and you see that the plasma volume showed a kind of a increase and then decreased. So I would say if we were to focus just on the first part of the sunlight exposure, it's pretty well correlated, but then it decreased for other systems, which are more linked to, I guess, to reset of the baroreflex, these kind of things, because the body had to cope with this extra volume of blood, and then that just changed completely the expected association between the variables. And eventually, there could be some kind of sympathetic overactivity because of the heat, kind of accumulated fatigue as well. So I'm not reporting all the wellness measure we have, but that's suggesting as well. So again, heart rate, and I know you're going to touch on that this afternoon as well. Heart rate measure is a pretty cool tool, but as long as you consider the context, and as long as the context changes, the way you interpret the data changes again. So this is why it's not easy, definitely.
Yeah. Thank you, Martin, for always looking for very practical solution for athlete. Coming back on the remark from Aaron and the lack of correlation and the fact that your plasma volume decreased after 4 days again, I think that you estimate the plasma volume from hematocrit only. Is it that? So do you think that your measure and your estimation of plasma volume might have been biased by any modification in hemoglobin mass?
Maybe, yeah. I have no alternative measures, so I can't really check for that, but yeah.
Your report of your data is consistent with the literature. Is what you do see is an early plasma volume increase. It'll come back down, but what happens then is with the initiation of exercise, it'll come back down, it'll expand with the exercise, and it'll expand up very substantial. But, you know, plasma volume is something that's easy. I'm not saying it's not important, but it's something that's easy to measure and changes quite a bit. But you can find heat acclimatization studies that show all the improvements without a plasma volume expansion. And we often think about it related to the lower the heart rate because of that one figure from Sine's paper. But when you look at that data, those really lined up different days. And as I said, you can show the reduced strain without a plasma volume expansion. So it's probably more than just that simple relationship of filling.
Yeah. Agree, definitely, yeah.
Oh, go for it.
Thank you. Very nice presentation. I was wondering why you chose to show us. I suspect you did more analysis, but why did you choose to show us only the RMSSD from heart rate variability?
Yeah. With the way we collected the data, so just 5 minutes seated in the morning, that's to me the most reliable and more valid measure of autonomic nervous activity. So I'm not a believer in the other spectral analysis because of lack of reliability, because of lack of validity as well. So I'm very happy with just RMSSD, and I didn't even, because of the research we've done in the past, I'm happy to stick with this index. The most important factor is that we didn't control for ventilation, and our RMSSD is ventilation free, let's say, compared with the other measure. We would need to have a fixed bracing rate, for example, which is again impossible to implement in practice if you were to collect heart variability every day over 2 months.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately.